The intended bride arrived at the incorrect homestead. Yet the silent child grasped her dress and murmured, "Heaven has delivered you to our door." Wyoming frontier, February of 1870. Bitter winds sliced through the endless prairie like razors, whipping snow into fierce whirlwinds that erased the skyline. Far from civilization, the boundless white expanse appeared untouched by humanity, quiet, sacred, and merciless. Against that emptiness walked a woman. Isabella Montgomery clutched her woolen wrap closer to her neck, her leather boots breaking through the thick snow as she neared the shadowy outline of a frontier dwelling. Her covered hand shook as she lifted it toward the entrance. Before her fingers met the timber, the massive door groaned open. A towering figure occupied the doorway. His gaze, storm-cloud gray and harsh as the gale, examined her as though she were an apparition. Deep creases surrounded his lips. His jacket hung loose enough to reveal a weathered pistol at his waist and a golden marriage band still circling his finger. Isabella found her voice. "I am Isabella Montgomery," she declared. "The Denver Marriage Bureau sent me here. I am promised to a gentleman named Brennan." The man's eyes narrowed slowly, then his mouth tightened. "I'm called Jake Morrison," he replied, "and I requested no wife." A blast of wind struck her spine like a blow, yet Isabella remained steady. "There's been an error," she said, fighting to maintain composure. "The correspondence indicated this was Copper Creek Ranch." "This is Copper Creek, correct?" "It is," Jake answered curtly. "But no Brennan lives here. You've reached the wrong homestead, Miss Montgomery." Pivoted halfway, preparing to close. The door, Isabella stepped nearer. "Please," she pleaded. "A blizzard approaches, and the final stagecoach departed for Cedar Junction. I have no other refuge." Jake paused for just a moment, then he moved aside. "You may enter, but only until morning." She released her breath, her body throbbing with cold and weariness, and stepped across the threshold. The heat inside felt like sinking into a distant memory. The ranch dwelling was modest, yet sturdy as stone hearth, burning bright. Rough-hewn furnishings, walls that spoke of years without joy. She set her small traveling case beside the entrance and surveyed the room. A single child's cap hung next to a man's musket. A child's carved pony sat forgotten near the flames. And on the mantel, partially dusted, rested a woman's photograph. Jake followed her stare. "She died for years past," he said rigidly. "My bride." Isabella nodded gently, then faced him again. "I didn't come here to take anyone's place," she said. "I simply have nowhere else to turn." He remained silent, merely gesturing toward the spare chamber down the corridor. "You can rest there tonight. At dawn, I'll escort you back to Cedar Junction." She wished to protest, but exhaustion overwhelmed her, so she nodded and moved toward the hallway. Then, before she could advance further, sound halted them, both gentle footsteps. From the shadows of a nearby room, a tiny figure appeared. A girl, perhaps 4 years old, barefoot in a worn pink nightgown. Her auburn hair fell in tangled waves past her shoulders. Her face was ghostly pale, her eyes wide, as if she had witnessed something no child should ever see. Jake froze, his hand moved instinctively to his side, not for his weapon, but for balance. The girl walked directly toward Isabella. Without speaking, small fingers reached out, grasped the hem of Isabella's dress. And in a voice unheard for 4 years, soft, breathless, broken, the child whispered, "Heaven has delivered you to our door." The room became silent. Jake's breathing stopped in his chest. He stepped forward. "Sarah." The little girl said nothing more, but her hold on Isabella's dress tightened. Her body pressed gently against the warmth of a stranger. Jake knelt slowly, wonder covering his features. "She hasn't uttered a word," he murmured. Not since he couldn't complete the thought. The words carried too much weight. Isabella knelt to meet the girl's gaze. "Hello, precious," she said tenderly. "I'm called Isabella." The child looked up, lips quivering. "You disappear too?" she asked, barely audible. Isabella's heart shattered. Like ice, she touched the girl's face. "No," she said. "Not tonight." Jake stood in silence, his hands balled at his sides, eyes filled with something between wonder and terror. He looked at Isabella, and for the first time since her arrival, his voice gentled. "Remain," he said, "at least until the storm ends." Isabella nodded once, but deep inside she understood. The storm had already arrived, and she was already within it. The tempest refused to break. It lingered heavy across the land, burying the valleys in white and sealing the paths in silence. Days turned, but the snow only accumulated. Jake spoke little. But the morning after Isabella's arrival, he informed her she could remain several more days until the weather improved. He didn't say it warmly, but not harshly either. It was simply truth. Isabella accepted without question. She had nowhere else to be. The ranch house seemed frozen in time. Memory clung to every corner, heavy, unchanging. On the mantel, the portrait of a woman gazed over the room with quiet grace. Her hair was arranged elegantly, her expression gentle but serious. A fine layer of dust on the frame suggested it had been undisturbed for months, possibly longer. A music box sat in the parlor, its surface worn, melody silent. Isabella traced her fingers along its edge but didn't wind it. She imagined it had once played with happiness, perhaps lullabies. Now it held only stillness. In the wardrobe of her guest chamber, she discovered a gown still hanging fine silk. Pale green, the sleeves were sewn with precision. She knew, without asking, that it had belonged to the late Mrs. Morrison. Perhaps Jake had intended to store it away. Perhaps he couldn't bear to. Jake remained withdrawn, spoke in brief, practical phrases. He rarely looked at her directly, yet his actions were careful, considerate. He stacked extra wood by the fire before she woke. He secured a loose shutter. In her room, when the wind rattled through, he mended a broken spoon handle after watching her struggle to eat soup. These things he did wordlessly, as if he were maintaining the house for no one specific. Isabella noticed, and she comprehended. Sarah, meanwhile, began to flourish like a timid wildflower in winter. Initially, the girl lingered at the room's edge, never near. She trailed Isabella with her eyes, clutching a small cloth doll with missing eyes. She didn't speak again, not even a whisper, but she observed. One afternoon, while Isabella sat by the window mending her sleeve, Sarah placed a folded paper beside her on the table and hurried away. It was a sketch 3 stick figures, one tall man, one woman with golden hair, and a small girl holding both their hands. Above them, a brilliant sun, and something written in uncertain letters. Family. Isabella pressed the paper to her heart, her breath catching. The following morning, Sarah brought her a lopsided plate of cornbread, half-burned and uneven. The kitchen smelled of flour and char. Isabella thanked her as though it were a banquet and consumed every morsel with gratitude. Sarah smiled for the first time. Teeny, uncertain, but genuine. Later that week, while Jake labored in the stable, Isabella sat outside with Sarah in the pale sunlight. The girl climbed into her lap and curled there as if she belonged. Read to her from a worn prayer book she found on the shelf. Sarah didn't grasp all the words, but she listened. Her small fingers played with the edge of Isabella's collar. Inside, through the glass, Jake watched them. He didn't interfere. The warmth between them didn't banish the cold, but it created a space within a quiet flame that pushed back the darkness. Yet beneath every tender moment, something remained unspoken. Something that lurked in Jake's distant stare. Something that trembled behind Sarah's silence. The house was mending, perhaps, but it wasn't complete. It's not yet. Jake discovered the document. By chance. He had been looking through the guest room for additional quilts. Isabella had mentioned the chill the previous evening when he spotted the envelope tucked beneath a folded shawl. He shouldn't have read it. But the paper was open, and curiosity had a way of becoming something else when silence filled a home. The penmanship was graceful, but the words cut deeply. Her wounds have mended sufficiently. She may live a full and healthy existence. However, the trauma to her lower body has caused permanent damage. The possibility of bearing children is unlikely to impossible. Jake folded the letter slowly, as though it were made of crystal. That evening, damned, The fire burned low in the hearth, casting long shadows across the floor. Sarah was already sleeping upstairs. Outside, the wind moaned through the bare trees. Isabella sat in the armchair, a blanket over her shoulders, gazing into the coals. Jake stood near the window, his arms folded, jaw rigid. He watched her for a moment before speaking. "I discovered a document today," he said. Her shoulders tensed. She didn't face him. "I didn't intend to intrude," he added, quieter now. "I know," she said softly. Then after a pause, "You read it." "I did." Silence stretched between them, thick and uncertain. She finally turned toward him. Her face was composed, but her eyes revealed everything: the shame, the pain, the fear of being seen too clearly. "I was a field medic," she began. "During the conflict, not by training, just by need." Jake sat across from her, said nothing, only listened. "There was this one soldier," she said, voice barely above a whisper, "no older than 16. He was carried to us wrapped in a Confederate flag. His father held him like he was still alive, but he had been gone for hours." Her fingers gripped the fabric of her dress. "Every night after that I dreamed of his eyes, and then came the cannon fire." She touched her side instinctively, as if she still felt the wound beneath her ribs. "They said I was fortunate to survive, but the damage was irreversible. I will never bear children of my own." Jake looked at her, not with pity, not with sorrow, but with something steadier. "You preserved lives," he said, "and paid a cost most. Soldiers couldn't endure." She blinked, surprised. "There are wounds you can see," he continued, "and others that remain hidden. But I believe you've endured better than anyone I've ever known." She looked away, eyes glistening, lips pressed tight. "I don't want your pity," she whispered. "You don't have it," he replied. "Only my admiration." Their eyes met in the flickering firelight. For the first time, she felt seen as something damaged, but as someone complete in her own right. The silence that followed was no longer uncomfortable. It was something else entirely, something honest, something human. She smiled faintly. "Thank you," she said. Jake nodded once, slowly in that quiet room with winter howling outside and memory pressing in from all sides. A fragile thread stretched between them, thin but real. It wasn't yet love, but it was no longer distance. It started with a sketch. Isabella found it tucked beneath Sarah's pillow while changing the bedding. The child had taken to drawing frequently now crude pictures of horses, stick figure families beneath yellow suns. But this one was different, darker. She unfolded the paper slowly. The lines were jagged, frantic. A small figure woman stood at the page's edge, her arms extended. Near her, a looming shadow, tall and thick-armed, pulling the woman away. Beside them, another figure lay on the ground. Above his head were 3 crooked words scrawled in clumsy handwriting: "Papa sleeping." Isabella stared at it for a long time. That evening, she brought it to the parlor where Jake was oiling the hinges of the front door. She waited until he finished, then held it out without a word. He took it, glanced once, and slowly sat down. "She draws frequently," he said, voice flat. "But not like this," Isabella replied. He nodded once, more to himself than to her. There was a long pause. The air between them chilled. "I've never asked," she began carefully. "What happened to your wife?" Jake said nothing at first. Then he set the drawing aside, elbows resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the floor. "I was drinking," he said, "that night." His voice was quiet, but every word carried weight. There had been a disagreement earlier. I don't even recall what. About, she went upstairs with Sarah, and I remained by the fire, drank more than I should have. When I woke the next morning, he stopped. Isabella leaned forward gently. "What did you wake to?" Jake's eyes were hollow. "Blood on my clothes on the floorboards near the front door. My wife was gone, so was her cloak." He rubbed his temples. With both hands, the marshal came, asked questions, but there was no body, no message, just gone. They declared it a disappearance. "And you?" she asked softly. They said she fled. Others weren't convinced. Isabella watched him carefully. "Do you believe you harmed her?" His jaw clenched. I don't know. Silence fell again, wetter than snow. I've tried to remember, he said. I've prayed for memories, fragments, anything, but there's nothing. The headache and that cursed blood. Isabella swallowed hard. Why didn't you tell me? Jake looked up at her finally. Would you have remained if I had? She had no answer. Later that week, when Jake took the wagon to town for provisions, Isabella made her way on foot to a nearby cabin tucked at the forest's edge. It belonged to a woman the townspeople had mentioned, a widow named Mrs. Fletcher, said to be half-blind but sharp as winter. Mrs. Fletcher answered the door with a shawl wrapped tightly around her frame and a long scar down the side of her face. She peered at Isabella with one good eye. Jake Morrison's woman, are you? I am staying with him, Isabella said cautiously. I have questions, the old woman grunted. Don't we all? Isabella explained what little she knew about the drawing, about the blood, about Jake's lost memory. Mrs. Fletcher listened, rocking slowly on her heels. That night, she said finally, I heard something a cry around midnight, but my husband was already dead by then, and I don't go seeking trouble in the dark. Next morning, I saw tracks in the snow leading from their place down toward the canyon. Just one set? Isabella asked. Two, the woman replied, but only one came back. Isabella's heart skipped. You told the marshal? Marshall was Jake's brother. Didn't want scandal? Told me to keep quiet, so I did. She looked away, voice softening. But I always felt that boy deserved the truth, even if he was too shattered to seek it. Isabella stood in the doorway, wind brushing her cloak, mind spinning. Footprints, a cry, blood Jake couldn't explain, and a child who remembered more than anyone realized. The past wasn't dead. It had only been waiting. The snow didn't cease, but something inside the house began to thaw. Each day brought small, quiet changes. Sarah laughed, now soft little sounds like wind chimes in spring. Isabella taught her how to thread a needle, to pull the thread gently through fabric without yanking. Their first project was a pillowcase. The stitches were crooked, the pattern messy. But Sarah beamed with pride when she finished the first rows. Jake watched them from the doorway one morning, arms crossed, leaning slightly against the frame. He said nothing, but Isabella noticed. The way his shoulders lowered, how his jaw relaxed. Later that afternoon, he took Sarah outside. The sky was a pale gray dome above them, flakes drifting steady like feathers. He lifted her onto the back of a sorrel mare, slow and careful. Sarah's legs dangled far above the stirrups, but her grin stretched from ear to ear. This one's gentle, Jake said. Her name's Belle. Isabella stood at the fence, gloved hands resting on the weathered wood, watched as he walked beside the horse, one hand on Sarah's back, guiding her in a slow circle around the yard. Each time Sarah passed by, she waved. Shh, she trusts you, Isabella said when they returned. Jake helped the girl down, brushing snow from her cap. I suppose she knows. When someone's worth trusting. At night, the wind howled fiercer than before. A full blizzard settled in, and the windows shuddered against the storm's breath. When Isabella stepped outside to retrieve a forgotten pail, the cold caught her throat like a slap. She wore only her shawl and a thin scarf before she could return. Inside, Jake appeared behind her. He reached without a word, pulling his own thick coat from his shoulders and draping it over hers. You'll freeze like that, he murmured. Their faces were close. It's too close. Snow clung to his lashes, to the brim of his hat. His breath curled in the narrow space between them, warm against her cheek. His hands lingered as he adjusted the coats, collar, fingers brushing her neck. Isabella looked up at him. His eyes weren't cold anymore. They were weary, maybe wounded, but open in a way she had never seen before. Thank you, she said, voice nearly lost to the wind. He nodded once, then turned to open the door. Back inside, they stood near the fire, the coat still wrapped around her. Sarah was asleep in the rocking chair, her doll resting on her chest. The storm outside was ruthless, but the room glowed golden. I met her at a harvest festival, Jake said suddenly. Isabella looked up. My wife, her name was Catherine. She wore yellow, always yellow, even in winter. She used to tease me about the way I walked in spurs, said I sounded like a lame horse. Isabella smiled gently. She sounds spirited. She was, he said. She kept this place alive long before I knew how. Taught me how to cook, how to hold Sarah. Without being terrified, I was terrible with babies. His smile flickered, then faded. I still wear this. He lifted his left hand, showing the ring. Because I'm afraid if I remove it, I'll forget the sound of her laugh. Isabella reached out. Slowly, carefully. Her hand came to rest over his heart, just above the heartbeat. Maybe, she said, she wants you to remember something else now. Not just her laugh, but the way she loved you, and how much you still have left to give. Jake swallowed hard. I don't know how, he said. You do, she replied. You already are. His hand hovered just beneath hers, not touching, but close. The storm raged outside, fierce and unforgiving. Inside, the warmth between them held fragile, but re-land for the first time since she arrived. Isabella didn't feel like a guest in this house. She felt like she had been expected. The snow had begun to melt. Days grew longer, though the air still bit with winter's breath. Inside the house, the quiet rhythm of newfound warmth continued Isabella's sewing. Jake's repairs, Sarah's laughter in the yard. But peace has a way of warning just before it shatters. 1. Afternoon, while Jake was tending to the cattle beyond the eastern pasture, a rider approached the ranch. Isabella stood in the doorway, shielding her eyes from the sun. As the man dismounted, she saw he wore a dust-covered coat, a battered hat, pulled low. His boots dragged with the weight of distance, but something about his bearing was familiar. Too familiar. Isabella stepped forward cautiously. Can I help you? She asked. The man removed his hat. Beneath it was a face weathered by years, but unmistakable hard-set jaw, eyes like rusted iron. Name's Garrett, he said. Used to work this place a few years back. Heard Jake Morrison might still be living here. Isabella nodded slowly, throat tightening. Sarah had come to the doorway beside her, small hand wrapped around Isabella's fingers. But the moment the girl saw the man, her entire body stiffened. Then she turned and fled. Sarah, Isabella called. But the girl was already inside, vanishing down the hall. Isabella turned back to Garrett. He's out by the eastern pasture, she said tightly. Garrett nodded once, then began walking. Inside, Isabella found Sarah curled beneath the bed in the guest room, her tiny frame shaking violently. She knelt down. Sweetheart, what is it? Didn't speak. She simply grabbed a piece of charcoal from the nearby sewing table and frantically drew on the wooden floorboards fast. Isabella watched. A woman, a child, a man with a blade, blood, the same shadowy figure from Sarah's past drawings. Isabella's heart pounded. She stood and made for the rifle mounted above the fireplace. But before her hands reached it, the door slammed open. Garrett. His eyes found her with eerie calm. She remembers, doesn't she? He said. Isabella stepped back. You killed her, she said. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. She wasn't supposed to be there. Neither was the kid. But your man, Jake, was too deep in drink to see straight. He stepped forward, pulling a knife from beneath his coat. Can't risk her talking now. Isabella's hand darted for the rifle, but he was faster. He knocked it aside, sending it clattering across the floor. She turned, trying to run, but he caught her by the arm. A scream burst from her lips as he shoved her to the ground and raised the knife. Then a blur. Sarah. The child darted from the hallway, screaming in pure terror. No. Isabella twisted, throwing herself between the man and the girl just as the knife came down. The blade cut deep. She collapsed, blood blooming across her bodice. Isabella. Jake's voice roared from the doorway. The crack of a rifle shattered the air. Garrett stumbled backward, clutching his side. Jake advanced, gun still raised, faced a storm of fury. He kicked the knife from the man's reach and knelt beside Isabella. Blood soaked the floor. "Stay with me," Jake said hoarsely. Isabella's eyes fluttered. Sarah crawled beside her, sobbing uncontrollably. Then, through the choking gasps, came the sound that shattered everything. "Mama," Sarah screamed. "Mama, don't go." Jake froze. Tears streamed down the girl's face as she clung to Isabella's arm. Outside, neighbors drawn by the gunshot began to arrive. One of them, a former deputy, recognized Garrett immediately. They called for the marshal. It didn't take long for the truth to unravel. With Sarah's trembling testimony and the neighbor's recollection of the cry years ago, Garrett was arrested. Jake gave his statement with a hollow voice, but nothing mattered more in those hours than the fever that followed. Isabella drifted in, and out of consciousness, her skin pale as moonlight, her breath shallow. Jake barely left her side. He sat through the nights, cooling her brow, whispering her name, begging her to fight once. When the fever broke briefly, she stirred. Her eyes met his. "You stayed," she whispered. "I never should have let you get hurt," he choked. She smiled faintly. "Worth it for her." From the doorway, Sarah tiptoed in. She climbed onto the bed beside Isabella and gently placed a damp cloth across her forehead, mimicking what she'd seen Jake do. Then, looking at him with eyes far older than her years, she whispered, "She's my mama now." And Jake, broken, breathless, could no longer deny the truth in that. He leaned down, pressed Isabella's hand to his lips, and said, "You saved us both." Isabella stood at the window long after the fire had died, watching snow fall in quiet spirals. Outside, the wound across her ribs had mostly healed, but the ache inside her had only grown. She couldn't stay. Not after everything, not when she could never give Jake what his wife once did. That morning, she sat at the kitchen table and wrote with a trembling hand, "Dear Jake, you have given me a warmth I thought I'd never feel again. I am not complete. I cannot bear children, and you deserve more than what I can offer. You and Sarah need someone who can give you a real future, not just fragments of one. Please know that I love you both, but love is not always enough." She folded the letter carefully and placed it on the mantel beneath the photograph of Catherine. Then she turned to pack. Upstairs, Sarah stirred from her nap. The house was quiet, too quiet. She crept down the stairs in her socks, doll clutched in her arms. That was when she saw the letter. Her name scrawled in the second paragraph right. After the words, "I cannot be her mother," her chest tightened. She simply turned, walked back up the stairs, pulled on her boots, her scarf, and slipped quietly out into the snow. By the time Isabella noticed the front door ajar, the wind had begun to pick up again. Panic clutched her chest. She raced upstairs, calling Sarah's name, tearing through rooms. "Nothing, Jake," she screamed, rushing outside. "She's gone." I just returned from the barn and dropped the saddle in the snow. "What do you mean she's gone?" She read the letter, Isabella said, eyes wild with guilt. "She thinks I'm leaving because of her." Without another word, Jake ran to the barn, saddled the mare with practiced speed, and hoisted Isabella up behind him. The storm was coming in faster than they'd feared. White swallowed the horizon. Tracks in the snow, already blurred by the wind. They searched the creek bed. The tree line called until their throats were raw. "Sarah," Jake shouted into the wind. "Sarah, come back." But only silence answered. Then, just before nightfall, Isabella spotted a splash of pink between the trees. Jake slid off the horse before it stopped moving. There, huddled beneath a gnarled oak, lay Sarah, arms wrapped around her doll, cheeks pale, eyes barely open. Baby Isabella choked out, falling to her knees. "What have you done?" Sarah's lips trembled. "You don't want me anymore," Isabella pulled her clothes, cradling her with shaking arms. "No," she whispered, pressing her forehead to the child's. "I was never leaving you. I thought I was protecting you, but I was wrong." Jake knelt beside them, wrapping his coat around them both, his hands trembling. "Don't you ever run from us again," he said, voice cracking. "You're our little girl." "Nothing changes that." Sarah's small arms reached up, locking around Isabella's neck. "I want you to be my mama forever," she whispered. And Isabella, crying now, held her tighter. "Then I will be," she said, "forever if you'll have me." Jake's hand found Isabella's, squeezing it in silent agreement. In the middle of the snow-covered forest, with the wind howling and the past finally behind them, a broken family was made whole again. The next morning, the storm had passed. The world outside was blanketed in fresh white. Trees bowed under snow, and the air was still and cold. Inside, the house stirred gently, fire crackling, stew warming on the stove, and the soft hum of life returning after a long, hard night. Sarah lay curled beneath a quilt beside Isabella, her small fingers twined with hers. She had not let go. Since they found her, Jake stood near the window, arms crossed, watching the horizon. He looked tired but different lighter. Resolved, after breakfast, he asked Isabella and Sarah to take a walk. They bundled up, stepping into the snow together. The sun had returned, casting golden light over the frozen world. At the creek, Jake stopped and turned. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what makes a family." Isabella waited, heart already full. He pulled a small velvet pouch from his coat. Inside was a ring-worn simple, trembling slightly in his fingers. "I wore this too long," he said, holding up his left hand. Then he slowly removed his wedding band and held it in his palm. "She's gone, and I loved her. But loving her doesn't mean I stop living." He looked at Isabella, his voice soft. "Sarah needs a mother, and I need you." Tears welled in her eyes. "Family isn't about where we come from," Jake said. "It's about where we choose to stay." Then he dropped to one knee. "I choose you, Isabella Montgomery. Will you marry me?" She didn't answer with words at first. She dropped to her knees beside him, arms wrapping around Sarah, who had followed close behind. "I'm sorry," Isabella whispered to the child. "I'm sorry. I made you think I didn't want you." Sarah clung to her. "I knew you did. I just got scared." Isabella turned to Jake, her hand still resting over Sarah's. "I was certain I'd missed my chance to be part of something whole, that I was only good at leaving." Jake reached for her hand. "But you stayed," he said, "and so will I." She nodded, tears trailing down her cheeks. "Yes, I'll marry you." He slid the ring onto her finger, his wife's ring, now carrying a new promise. 1 week later, the church in Cedar Junction opened for a quiet wedding. The townspeople filled the pews, offering warm glances and quiet blessings. They had heard the story how Isabella had bled to protect a child who had not spoken in years. How Jake had found peace in the woman he never expected. Simple wildflowers lined the aisle. Jake stood at the altar in his best shirt, visibly nervous. Then the doors opened. Isabella entered in a dress borrowed from the town seamstress, hair pinned with sprigs of baby's breath. But it was Sarah who turned every head, walking proudly. In her pink dress, scattering petals with the joy only a child could carry. When the preacher asked who gave the bride away, Sarah spoke without hesitation. "I do." Laughter filled the room. Jake's eyes filled with light, after the vows, after the kiss. And after Sarah threw her arms around both of them. The three walked out together into the sun, no longer bound by grief, but united by grace.